Welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. On this podcast, we talk about all things to increase performance, add muscle, improve body composition, do all of it within a flexible framework without destroying your health. Today, we've got a great program. We have Erin Silver Lee. She is the newer CEO over at Flow Neuroscience. You may be familiar with them if you're in the US. They took over a previous device that was called the Halo device. And the Halo device was using non invasive brain stimulation, sometimes called TDCS. And the original Halo device was for more on the motor cortex for enhancing athletic performance. And I purchased one of the early devices quite some time ago. Played around with it, and it was pretty interesting. The product was pretty solid, had some pros, had some cons, but it was the first kind of consumer grade version of it. And if you look into the research on TDCS, it's pretty interesting and pretty substantial, actually. So when I saw that they were acquired by Flow, I reached out to her and wanted to have her on the podcast to explain everything that was going on. So this was not a sponsorship from them, but I looked at a lot of the research and stuff they were doing and wanted to chat with them more about it. And she was very kind to offer up her precious time so we can have this chat. And so we talked all about just the background with Flow Neuroscience, the acquisition of Halo, different aspects of this technology for mental performance, impact upon sleep, and even neuroplasticity, focus and concentration. What are all of the benefits? And then we also talked about navigating FDA regulation, the difference of that versus consumer approval, and kind of what is their path going forward. So it's very interesting technology. For the most part, there's been not much in the consumer area in this area, and the ones I've seen haven't really had much data to back up their device. So I think you will really enjoy this conversation with Erin, who is the CEO there. And if you want more information from me, check out my newsletter. Go to miketnelson.com, and up at the top, you'll find a button that says newsletter. We'll put a direct link in the podcast down below here. And this will have you hop on. And if you have any questions, you can just hit reply there. I send out newsletters primarily daily on everything related to all the items we talk about on the podcast here. So if you want more information, hop on there. We'll put links to all of the great stuff over at Halo and Flow in the podcast here too. So make sure to check them out. So without further ado, here is my chat with Erin. Welcome to the podcast, Erin. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. I guess
Yeah.
the main question is, I know you guys took over what used to be Halo Neuroscience, and do you want to give us a little background on why you did that and how you started and kind of pivoted to where you're at now? Because some people listening to this podcast may be familiar more with the Halo device than the newer device. So maybe give us some background and kind of give us up to speed of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Flow Neuroscience as a business, which is the company that acquired Halo Sport, we've been around for about 10 years. So, we were founded in Malmö, Sweden in 2016. And really, our mission and vision is around driving accessible and affordable non-drug-based treatments for the world's leading mental health conditions. And we have been plugging away in Europe for the last 4 years. We have 50,000 users. We work with the NHS, 900 clinicians, regulated, and we're awaiting FDA approval for our clinical depression product. And in early 2020, while we were sort of developing the clinical product, unfortunately, Halo as a business, I think, fell victim to the early days of COVID. And one of the things that was very interesting and remains very interesting to us about Halo Sport was their focus on motor cortex stimulation
Mm-hmm.
as a complementary or supplementary stimulation mechanism for what we're doing with the frontal stimulation. So we really see ourselves as focusing on first, like clinical indications for the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, then also wellness indications or mental performance indications. And you can imagine how much more powerful that becomes with the integration of sort of that motor cortex physical stimulation. So that was the impetus behind the acquisition. I think during COVID, it was very difficult to do. I think the product itself needed some work. And I think what we've learned is maybe the communication wasn't as strong as it should have been during that handover. What I will say to former Halo Sport users, because it's far and away the number one question I get when I speak to folks is, are you done with motor cortex? Does Halo Sport
That was
done?
one of my questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like, is Halo Sport done? Well, we can dig more into this. And the
Yeah,
short
it's
answer is
good.
no. No. The short answer is no.
And so the newer device then is focusing on a different part of the brain from the motor cortex, correct?
Yes, so we focus on the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is associated with executive function. That includes things like memory, fine motor skills, focus, concentration, sleep, mood. And what we've seen over the last, 4 years across those 50,000 users is there was actually quite a large subset of folks who were not depressed at all who were using the product. And we saw meaningful improvements in things like sleep, concentration. I think, in 3 weeks, 60% of folks had improvements in sleep, 65% had improvements in concentration. And that's for people who aren't depressed. And then we also started to see a component of sort of athletes, super performers, whether that's business or sports, who were using it to improve their overall sort of mental performance. And that was the impetus behind relaunching the Halo brand with the goal of sort of saying we're going to focus first on mental performance, which is a big part of overall performance, as I'm sure most athletes will tell you, and then later sort of layering on the physical component.
Awesome. So if we dig into that a little bit more, one of
Yeah.
the areas that surprised me that you mentioned is sleep. How does stimulating that part of the brain affect sleep? And then, since most of our listeners are on audio, do you want to just give a brief description of what the device kind of looks like so they have a frame of reference that they can kind of picture in their head?
Yes. Okay. Asking me to be descriptive. I'll start with sort of the overall device. When I first saw it, it sort of reminded me a little bit of like a sideways Sony Walkman headset, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not sort of trying to
That's
do
a good
the
one.
device a disservice, but the sort of old school Walkman headsets, but flipped, so it's centered on your forehead, and there's two electrodes for stimulation that target the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Very lightweight device, very easy to use. I think I get a lot of questions on the arc in the middle because you may see other stimulation devices that sort of are just a headband. That serves a couple different purposes. You can't put it on upside down. You can't put it on backwards. Reduces things like headaches when you're wearing sort of a tight headband. You can also have headaches. So that was an intentional design choice. And you wear the device 30 minutes a day, anywhere from 3 to 5 times a week, depending on what you're focused on from clinical to non-clinical indications. And so sleep is a really interesting one. And there's a couple different schools of thought. The first is particularly in sort of a depressed population, when you have sort of an overactive or underactive control of the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that affects not only sort of your working memory, your processing ability, but also your ability at the end of the day to down regulate,
Mm,
go to sleep, right? And that's true to an extent with your healthy users, right? So there's a reduction in your lack of ability to downregulate, improves your overall sleep architecture in terms of, I'll sort of try and simplify this a little bit.
no, you can get as geeky as you want. That's fine.
Geeky as I want. Okay. So if you look at sort of REM sleep and slow wave sleep in particular, you can see a reduction in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity. I gotta come up with a short
It's
version of
interesting. They
that.
abbreviate everything else, but they rarely ever abbreviate that when people are talking, I've noticed. I don't know why, but
Well, it's like the abbreviation I don't think is that much more helpful because it's
no,
like
it's not.
LPFC, so that's in some ways harder to say.
It is.
So anyways, the simulation sort of decreases overall slow wave activity. As I mentioned, it improves sleep architecture. So there's a couple different mechanisms of action. And what I will say is like we continue to learn what's driving sort of what we see in sort of the symptom treatment. Like we know that symptoms respond, and we're trying to understand what are the different components that drive that for a particular user because it's going to vary.
So would a radical oversimplification be that for people who have the air quotes, the monkey mind, the racing thoughts, that type of thing, would this device potentially be more beneficial for them since it's trying to quiet and downregulate certain parts of the brain that we know tend to be overactive before sleep?
Yes, and it can also be, when you think about overall emotional regulation, right? It's increasing neural, that stimulation is it's actually increasing activity, improving neural plasticity, which in turn can also drive improved connections to other areas of the brain, like the amygdala, limbic structures, things like that. And so when you have an impaired activity in this region, you might be overreactive. So to your point,
Mm.
by bringing that back to sort of a steady state, you're reintroducing the ability to self-regulate and control sort of that pre-sleep arousal, for lack of a better word.
So you might be, how I also think about it is coupling it better to other parts of the brain. So you're getting a
Right.
little bit better communication. Like this little part of the brain is not off on its own island, having crazy thoughts that it can't regulate the rest of the body, that you're trying to couple it to other parts of the brain that are having a better overall control of both the body and the mind so that they're kind of, like a better word, cooperating a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, sleep, just like the brain itself and depression and other symptoms, everything is so interconnected. And it's obvious when I say it, right? But I think people, particularly those that don't have clinical depression or are generally otherwise well, may not initially recognize the impact of even sort of your average stressful day subconsciously on sleep and that
Sure.
hyperactivity, or an athlete training for a major performance or competition. They're, in many ways, they're some of the most controlled in terms of mental state, right? They spend
Yep.
years training, but even so, there's still this subconscious element that sometimes people can't put their finger on. Now, for those that suffer from chronic insomnia, which we sort of do not claim to treat, they can have a much different experience. And there are certainly other providers that focus more intently on insomnia itself, which is its own sort of clinical indication.
And the the 30 minutes, do you do anything at that point? Because I think one of the questions for people is, oh, do I just have to hang out and stare at a wall for 30 minutes when I do this or what?
So the impetus behind the platform and why we built a platform and not just a device is, while you're stimulating, your brain is actually primed to drive better habit formation, habit and behavior change. And so that was the impetus behind a lot of the content, right? So while you're stimulating, it's actually a very good time to start to build bedtime habits if you're doing it before bed. Or my colleague Sam uses it in the morning to prime for focus and uses that time to really lock in and prepare. So the short answer is like you should, and many people do take advantage of that time. Now, for others, they need to do it passively. Like some people use it in the car. I don't, but some people do. And in that case, again, it's a more passive interaction. So again, it depends. We recommend that you take advantage of the neuroplasticity, but you certainly don't have to. And there's many folks who don't and also see very good results.
So the theory then would be if you're using it before bed, like you are increasing neuroplasticity. So hopefully those other associations with your PM routine, maybe you're doing some, I'm a big fan of down regulation, do some breath work, like teach your brain and
Exactly.
body that it is the end of the day. You're not going to get up at 3 a.m. and work on your paper or work on your proposal or whatever it is, like have that sort of repetitive nature so that you can sort of entrain your body and your physiology and if this is increasing neuroplasticity, maybe you can shorten that sort of time period because now you have a more plastic brain that's more receptive to some of these changes that it can kind of, like you said, lock into it a little bit sooner instead of maybe taking 6 weeks to feel better. Maybe I'm just making up numbers, like 3 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever. It's shortening that time period of where you get those better associations.
Yeah, that's right. And again, it's mental training in the same way that we do physical training. And so you've got to build pathways in the same way that you're building muscle fibers, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
mental mental memory. So, you start your stimulation, you turn on your red light or, get off the blue light cell screen and start to, yeah, lock in for sleep or mellow out. And then I think over time, that becomes a habit, which is accelerated again by the stimulation. And a lot of users see it as me time, right? It's sort of my time to disconnect. It's something that I do for myself. It's less of a clinical treatment. It's more of, I guess, spa time is probably pretty strong, but it sort of sets the tone for what's ahead.
And for people that are new to the device, are there different program settings on it? Is there one that's kind of geared more towards sleep, or is it just kind of the same general mechanism you're trying to hit and you're just doing it at different times for different things?
So for now, the general baseline montage is standard. There is some flexibility on the number of sessions per week. I think what you'll see from us over the next couple quarters is the ability to drive a much greater degree of personalization.
Mm.
But we learn from users, we learn from what's happening in the real world from our clinical studies in terms of, who benefits from doing this at night for sleep. What does that protocol look like versus a focus protocol versus like an athletic protocol? And I'll be honest, some of the work around music where we have a lot of interest and a lot of users and athletics is very much day zero. There's still quite a bit for us to optimize, even in terms of montages within a montage. So today we try and make it very straightforward, one size fits most, but over time you'll see that expand.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I know it's very probably difficult to have slightly different protocols for each one or whatever, but I think they're from a consumer thing, I think there's definitely something to, oh, this is my sleep protocol or this is my, focus protocol. They're very
Absolutely.
much the singular focus, even though a lot of these things don't work that way directly on the brain. But I think from a consumer standpoint, they're very trained for better or worse to, oh, this is my supplement for sleep, or this thing only does this thing. They're very, it's the one thing only type thought pattern.
No, absolutely. And, I think it's interesting when you look at the clinical studies, it's not always evident that a greater degree of personalization drives better results, at least sort of at a high level. Now, again, like we're very bullish on personalization, and there's absolutely reason to believe that will change, particularly around sleep, where REM patterns are particularly personalized. That seems to be
Hmm.
less true for things like focus, mental performance, fine motor skills. And again, like you'll see that over time, our challenge is how do we make the technology accessible for as many people as possible while also giving some of those early adopter super users. And there are people out there absolutely keeping us on our toes. I think they've been doing some
Oh, I'm
experiments with
sure.
this. Yeah. I mean, and I love talking to them, right? They're like, I have this device, I've tried this one. And I'm sort of like, wow, you've got like a science lab in your basement, and that's
Yeah.
great for you. And we absolutely want to learn and partner from those users. But again, in terms of like regulatory approval, there are some limitations in what we can do from the gate.
So is the theory that it may improve REM sleep, which then in theory could improve, I think of like skill acquisition. So we know that a lot of times skill acquisition is hugely associated with the amount of REM sleep. I think it was some of the old mice studies, the first time they showed this, they put the little connectors in the mice's head and they were trying to watch what they were doing after maze running. And they saw that the mice were the same neural patterns were going that they were running through the maze, but they were going at a much accelerated rate. The thought being that you're kind of consolidating maybe some of those motor patterns you're learning during the day with REM sleep.
That's right. And I think everyone knows how important REM sleep is just generally to overall. I mean, anyone who's not had it for a few nights, like creatine aside, I haven't found that works for me, although I know there's some thoughts that doubling down on that can improve the perceived REM sleep. Very powerful. But yeah, I think you've summarized that better than I could.
Yeah. Is there any potentially early effects on deep sleep, or is it too early to tell anything yet?
Too early to tell for us, and I think what we've really been focused on is how can we continue to introduce a greater level of objectivity in terms of the way that we're measuring and understanding the brain. And so, quite a bit of our early evidence and some of the early open label results were really around self-reported information from users, what they were perceiving, what they see from their Oura Ring and their use of Flow and now Halo. And that's very helpful for us. We're indebted to them. But really, the future is, can we measure those waves directly, those alpha waves or those gamma waves? Can we understand a particular user? And then can we really deeply understand what's driving change for an individual user? And that's very important for us because there's a lot of snake oil out there, right? And we can hypothesize and we can say this is the theory
Yeah,
of
yeah.
action, but we really like to know. And I think our challenge is, like, in some ways, the measurement capabilities haven't kept up with our stimulation capabilities, but I think we'll get there in short order. So
Awesome. And we'll talk a little bit more about the wonderful data you guys have been working on too. And a little bit more background on the device. Does it do measuring, and how does the measuring affect the output, or is it purely looking at output now? How does that work from, you could probably even explain a little bit about anytime you hear, oh, this thing's zapping my brain, it sounds like a bad idea.
no, I know. And, it's funny. You're absolutely right. And I probably shouldn't say this, but I do because I think I am not a neuroscientist by background. And I think that's important because my goal is really to make the technology as accessible as I can to as many people as possible. And I think there's this belief that, if you're not a neuroscientist, you can't understand it. But when I first started, working with Flow, my parents were like, is this like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Like, what are you doing?
You're
Like,
zapping humans' brains. What are you working for
like,
this
haven't we
company, you
moved
crazy
beyond
person?
this? Yeah, I think there's this concept, like, having, like, how outdated and how, like, feral, really. And I think the reality is, as really, as humans, we are electric. The brain runs on electricity. I think ECT is sort of this wicked stepmother of a technology, and it has had some horrible effects.
And that was
Um,
electroconvulsive therapies that was used
electrical
many, many
therapy,
decades ago with very,
decades ago.
very brutal
Um,
videos if you ever watch them, which I would not recommend. I can't watch any of them.
No, I mean, they're horrific, right? And
Yeah.
you hear horror stories about people who had it inflicted on them. On the flip side, in some studies, it's actually tremendously effective, although that extreme strength of current came with those horrific side effects, many of
Yeah.
them permanent. To a lesser degree, it's a similar mechanism of action to TMS, right? So that uses magnetic stimulation, must be done in clinic, must be done by a clinician because it's so strong. Whereas our technology is really very mild, can be done at home, safe enough for home use. Yes, some tingling and redness, but overall, like, an incredibly safe technology with very limited side effects. We really do see this as the future in a number of different indications. And so I think we're trying to bring back, maybe we're trying to repair the reputation of electricity because it certainly hasn't been good to date. It certainly hasn't been good to date.
Yeah. And does the device do measurements also, or is it just kind of applying a set protocol, or how does that work, I guess? I'll leave
Yeah,
it kind
so
of open-ended.
our first device, in terms of the montage set protocol, like I said, there is some flexibility that can be adjusted by clinicians in terms of the length. So 30 minutes or more than 30 minutes per session and the number of sessions. And, I think if you look at the sort of clinical literature out there, far and away, the largest impact that we can drive on outcomes has to do with the length and frequency of those stimulations, right? So the number of stimulations and how long you're stimulating per day may seem obvious, right? The overall dosing.
Sure.
Uh, before you even get into personalization. Now, having said that, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, our big bet and our belief is that personalization can and should matter. And we have a second device that will hit the market early next year that integrates measurement and should unlock a degree of personalization. Now, again, we have to do that in a way that's accessible, but we've already seen incredible results on our ability to predict someone's response to stimulation, like anywhere from 85 to 90%. And then obviously you can imagine what we can do with that on the stimulation side. So the short answer is it's coming.
And once you have that ability to sort of listen to the response, I would imagine that opens you up to be more of a closed loop feedback where you could give a signal or start at a certain protocol or whatever, and then, air quotes, kind of listen to see what's going on. Do I see the right pattern? Is this what I expect? Oh, kind of goes this direction. So maybe I'll do this. Like it kind of gives you more personalization options, I would imagine at that point.
That's right. And I think people who are passionate about the space always, they jump to like, let's talk about how we can personalize the wavelengths and the stimulation patterns. And trust me, no one is as excited about that as we are. But what I think was interesting, and again, probably not surprising, and why we focused more on sort of that core experience and that standard experience is one of the challenges we have is, as with everything, is getting people to consistently create the habit of
Yeah.
stimulating, just like we brush our teeth. And so a lot of the personalization that we did initially was actually in the app, around the app experience, and starting to help some very basic habit formation without being overwhelming, right? Because it can certainly be, at least sometimes when I open my Aura Ring and my 8 Sleep and all of the other apps, it's just like information overload, and it just can be sometimes more stressful than helpful. And so we try and work up to that before we sort of unleash that.
You mentioned creativity and focus. Talk to us a little more about that because I think we're sort of seeing, this is my prediction, the incoming of all things neurology, cognition, even autonomic nervous system regulation. I feel like in the next, starting this year, next couple of years, those are going to be still very, very, I hate to use the word trendy because there's actually really good data and there's a lot of really interesting things coming that way, but maybe a lot more awareness focused in that area than what historically there has been.
Yeah. So we can talk about focus, although that's typically regulated again by the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That was one of the areas where we saw the fastest response for both depressed and non-depressed users. As I mentioned, like, and our co-founders use it before work for that exact purpose. And it really is driving, again, neuroplasticity, priming you for performance, driving increased connectivity across the brain. They swear by it. Now, I will say this in full transparency. I have certainly tried to use it for the same. Does it work for me quite as well as it does for our co-founders and others? So again, I'll be a good candidate for some of the personalization in this space. But to your point, I think a lot of the treatment or focus on the focus concentration space has been focused on pharmaceuticals. I think they can be effective, almost certainly, but they come with extreme side effects and they can form sort of long-term dependence. And I think we'll find, as with physical activity, that sort of priming your brain in the same way can drive meaningful improvements focus. And we've seen, like I said, 65, almost 70% improvement in 3 weeks in the ability to concentrate for our well users.
And is that something that would be the similar protocol? Like they would do this as part of their, it seems like everyone has a 17-step AM ritual now. Would it be part of that, or is it something you could say, hey, like in my case, I have to sit down and I have to write this newsletter. Could I put it on and do it while I'm doing the work, or is it something I have to do separate to sort of prime my brain to get into that state, and then I wouldn't use the device while I'm actually doing the task?
No, so one of our co-founders uses it while they start work, get into the day, and I think it helps focus him on those activities. Our other sort of my other colleague Sam, who I sort of use him as an example of like one of those Tim Cook's like wonderful morning protocols that we always have. He gets up, he does his yoga, he does his mindfulness, he wears Flow as part of that, sort of gets into the zone. That is not me. Like I wake up, my eyes are barely cracked, I take coffee, and I sit down for again. Some of this is user based. And again, it's what are your habits? Where are you trying to reinforce, rebuild those habits, drive sort of the right activity at the right time? So again, we fully appreciate it's not one size fits all, and the short answer is it sort of depends.
Got it. And more on, I guess, my own curiosity, I spent 10 years working for a medical device company in the past. They were more in the cardiac space.
Okay.
So I have a little bit of an idea of, in the US, the amount of FDA regulations and hoop hopping and all the dot your T's, cross your I, all the kind of stuff that goes in there. And I believe in the US, you're looking to get FDA approval for more of a clinician model, but there'll still be a consumer version also. So you're kind of taking both tracks. Is that correct?
Yeah, and sort of the impetus behind that was, look, we have always believed, because I think another question I get all the time is like, why now? Like, why are you entering the market with Halo now? Is it a money grab? Like, and that, as I remind people, like, look, we've been around for 10 years. We've been commercial
Yeah.
for five. We could have been in the US market 5 years ago. Our goal was really to legitimize the technology, right? And I think, again, there's been so many bad actors, unfortunately, that have promised the sun, the moon, and the stars.
Yep.
Uh, I think TDCS got a bad rap. And so we invested in clinical trials, we invested in clinical partnerships, very much wanted to build a reputation as a company you can trust. Now, obviously started with our depression treatment in Europe. We say, try it. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, no problem. We'll refund you. I think, our clinical trial was published in Nature Medicine, showed that we were twice as effective as leading antidepressants. None of the side effects. We've invested in regulatory approval in Europe, which is not an easy task in and of itself, whether
Yeah.
that's the RCE marking and then FDA. And I think maybe some of it was naivety, maybe some of it was based on all the feedback we had on how successful our trial was and all the real world evidence. That has been much more challenging than we anticipated. I think we'll get to a good outcome here. I think what's really frustrating is, when you look at benefit risk of our technology versus drugs, like when we're runaway more effective with way fewer side effects, but there's still a stigma around the technology, particularly technology you want to put in the home. And so I think it's fair to say that we've been held to a much different standard than other technologies. Some of that's first mover disadvantage, but it is what it is, right? I think we stand behind the data, and I think we'll get to a good outcome on the clinical product. Now, in parallel, since we have 50,000 users, we have this in over 800 clinics in Europe, we've seen a lot of real world success. And I think when you're committed to accessibility and ultimately affordability, there is a need to get the technology to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And that was the impetus behind releasing the Halo product in the US. We would not have done it if the results weren't there. It doesn't benefit, like I think people say money grab, like quite frankly, that's not what this is. It's really about getting it into the hands of users who need it. And I think the outreach we've had from folks looking for solutions because, modern medicine has left them behind sort of speaks to that. And then I guess the only thing I would say is, our goal has always been to cover the entire sort of continuum of health. We started with the very ill. Our goal is to get you back to baseline, maintain your results at baseline. And then there's always the question, well, if I'm not depressed or if I'm at baseline, can you make me sort of a superhuman? And I'll say we're not there yet, but I think we can optimize the way that people live their lives, and that hopefully we can bring some improvement. So that's the impetus behind Halo and Flow, but you will see them together.
No, I think that's great because a few other companies I've worked for just consulting and a few off things, they had the option of going the medical device route or the consumer route, and were actually advised, don't even bother trying to get FDA approval, just do the consumer version for obvious reasons of money, time, resources, everything else. So kudos to you guys for
Yeah.
doing all that stuff because I'm not to sound very conspiratorial, but the FDA historically is very set up for pharmaceutical trials, pharmaceutical setup. We saw this with when, MAPS even did, some of their work with psychedelics, even though they worked with the FDA to try to figure out what is the best way. And yeah, there was some of their issues there also, but it's just like the whole mindset is very set up with this randomized placebo-controlled pharmaceutical type model. And if you're outside of that, it seems to be exponentially more difficult on top of everything else.
And I guess maybe some of this was even maybe how naive we were at the time. I think we always felt, the data would speak for itself. We had a randomized placebo-controlled trial. We had two arms. And I think, when I tell people our FDA application was PMA, which is the most
Mm,
stringent process, right?
yeah,
Typically reserved for implantables, like very high risk devices. And that's because of the depression indication. I think people are really shocked. We've spent
yeah,
millions of dollars on regulatory approval. And I reiterate that because I think a lot of the devices in the space haven't done that. And to your point, there often is good reason for that. But if you believe in the technology, there are no shortcuts, right? And I say that as someone who is frequently frustrated by regulators. I do not think incentives are aligned, even if there are good people within the system. I think we've seen incredible bias. But again, we will never be able to compete with drugs if we don't at least have that same validation from the regulator. And it has not been easy and it has not been fair, but life's not fair. And the technology is too important. In the meantime, we are going to do everything that we can to get the technology to those who need it for other indications where the risk is obviously much lower. So I think at this rate, every new indication is like a 3-year regulatory process at a minimum. That's crazy when you think about how long that will
Yeah.
take to get it to folks who need it. It's too long in my opinion. I don't know what the answer is. We can do what we can do.
Yeah, I also feel like there should be some, and I know the FDA can, they don't have to follow what the recommendation of the panel is, depending upon what type of approval process you go through and all the other weird things that go with that. But I think there should be more put into that process if you're trying to treat things like depression and PTSD and things that historically we just don't have a lot of other good options. So I think you could, at least my argument would be, and this hasn't really gone over well with the FDA historically so far, but in those areas, to me, you should be allowed a little bit more leeway that if you can show safety, you can show outcomes, you're running a reasonable trial, that I feel like sometimes we're missing was it the dollar bills and trying to pick up pennies, right? We're trying to argue about these really, really infinitesimally small points when currently this and other technologies could be a great treatment for things that we historically just are not treating very well. I just feel like there should be a little bit more leeway if you're working in that area versus, oh, we're trying to improve this or that disease by like 2%. It doesn't even feel like it's a comparable thing. But again, I don't run the FDA or have anything to do with
No,
that.
hey, I totally look, I agree with you. And I think, we applied for breakthrough designation, which I think like on its face, the FDA says that they agree with you, right? They
Yeah,
said
yeah.
we want to fast track technologies that have a disproportionate impact. We were the first at-home stimulation device to get breakthrough designation. We've been talking to the FDA for 3 years. I think what they say in theory and what they do in practice are two very different things. And again, I'm painting the agency with a broad brush. I think there are
Yeah,
some
yeah, in general. We're not talking
people.
about the people there. We're just saying as an institution of approval as its whole. Yeah.
And to your point, like I think there's an awareness never, people get so tired of hearing about the mental health epidemic, but the reality is it gets worse every year. We've never had more drugs on the market. We've never had more discussion of behavioral therapy and psychiatry. Like something is not working. We have this technology that, by the way, is approved in Europe and is seen as so safe that we can sell it over the counter for depression. And I don't think I have to tell you, but Europe is not historically like very light on regulation. Like we have
No.
light bulbs over here, right? So I think that has been frustrating. And as an American, I always I'm like, we're the innovative country. Like we should be embracing new technology. And if and I think what we see is literally every other country we've engaged with has approved the technology except the FDA. And you do start to wear a tinfoil hat at a certain point when you see the drugs that continue to get approved and their impact. And you're just like, well, something doesn't seem quite right. But I do think when I look around the market, I think that the winds of change are blowing. And I think that's driven by consumers. And I think it's driven by people who want better for themselves, something else. And in this case, I believe like populist demand will drive regulatory change. Maybe that's always the case, but I think we're already starting to see that. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot more education around those areas now about how ineffective the historical treatments we have are. And again, they're definitely needed in some cases. They can be really beneficial for, a fair amount of people. But if you look at the actual data that's been published, there hasn't really been a lot of innovation over the past few decades. It's been very, very, very tiny. So I think people are realizing that, oh, maybe there are other things out there that can be beneficial. And I think the public pressure is probably the main thing that will bring the biggest amount of change.
Hopefully. And look, we're all about choice. I'm not here to
Yeah.
tell you that I mean, I think there's people that say, well, SSRIs have saved my life. Fantastic. That is amazing. And better living through chemistry. But there's also huge swaths of the population who are not well served by that or existing technologies. And don't we deserve to have really personalized and dynamic options? And that's all we're advocating for. And by the way, we're much less expensive and more accessible than many of those pharmaceuticals, which I think people find hard to believe. So again, like we just want to be held to the same standard, not a different standard as everyone else. And I think people will really benefit from it. And if we didn't believe that, and if the data didn't back us up, it would have been very easy to walk away because it's been quite a brutal struggle. But all it takes is to hear the stories of the people who are as skeptical as anyone that give it a shot, use it for 3 weeks, and it's life-changing, right? Not for everyone, but for a lot of folks. And I think that's what keeps you going.
Yeah. And I think people, my biased opinion is everyone should be able to make their own decisions. Obviously, work with your healthcare provider, work with your physician, but they should help
Absolutely.
educate you as the end person using this. Here's the pros, here's the cons, here's this option here, here's this option here. And then you and your physician, psychologist, psychiatrist, doctor, whatever, like you're working with someone who's educated in that field and they can help educate you on the pros and the cons. And you can kind of work out an agreement of, okay, let's try this. We'll do this for X amount of time. If that doesn't work, we'll go here. So it becomes more of educational process. Then you know what the pros and what the cons are from the available research, and hopefully you have more options to pick from. Right? I feel like now it's not really that. It's like, oh, let's try this drug or let's try that drug or this one, and it's so hopefully it'll be better in the future.
No, and you know what, and I will give I think the one thing that I've spent a lot of time like being very negative about the regulators, but I would say on the flip side, the one thing that has been pleasantly surprising to me is the response from clinicians, in particular the primary care space. I think we didn't have to tell them about the limitations of drugs. They're just
Yeah.
as frustrated as their patients. They're like, I
Yes.
don't have anything to offer folks.
Right.
They're
They
like,
don't
show us
have the
evidence.
optionality.
Yeah, they're like, show us the evidence, show us that it works, tell me the pros and cons, like
Yep.
let me understand what profiles this works for. But in Europe, they were the first ones to drive it off label, right? I think so. I didn't expect that. I thought that they
Mm.
would be a lot more skeptical, but the frontline clinicians have really embraced the technology and the product. So I think that more than anything gives me hope that I think we'll see stimulation really take off.
Yeah. The ones that I know I've talked to I think, are equally frustrated with the process. They're like, I get 7 minutes to talk to this person. I've only got like these four options. Like, this is like woefully inadequate for what I'm trying to do my job. I'm trying to help people. I'm trying to do the best I can within a system that's just not making any of it easy.
Absolutely. And you're going to spend 5 of those 7 minutes trying to enter stuff and your EHR in a
Yo.
way that they understand, right? It's a mess. Like you can't fault them. So they're like, give me something easy that, it doesn't double the time that I have. And I think that's what we've seen in Europe. So I guess I'm hopeful.
Yeah, yeah. And tell us about some of the trials you guys have done, which are actually pretty impressive.
Yeah, so we had our pivotal trial, which used for FDA approval, was on moderate to severe depression. That was 2 arms, flow as a monotherapy and flow as an adjunctive therapy. And that showed that we were twice as effective as the leading 21 antidepressants, none of the drug side effects. As I said, sort of only significant side effect was sort of stimulation, redness, tingling at the site. But in parallel, again, we really are science driven and data driven. And so as part of our partnerships with the NHS, we've published an additional 8 studies on everything from sleep to patient and clinician uptake. We've looked at postpartum depression, elderly comorbid depression, acute depression. So I think folks with community mental health, pre and post hospitalization. We're about to kick off a trial on minors. We are now looking in the US partnerships on pain and overall well-being pre and post surgery, for example,
Hmm.
like can we minimize the amount of drugs that someone is on. We've now kicked off pilots on addiction, both as a comorbid indication, as a direct indication. We have interest on TBI, traumatic brain injury, PTSD. We're about to kick a bipolar trial off. And I start to rattle these off, and people are like, what? Like, that is so many. Like, how can that be? Like, how can there be those indications? I think you'll all see them clustered in the same area, the same region of the brain, and where individuals are typically poorly served by traditional treatments. Do I expect us to be as successful in all of them as we've been with depression? Absolutely not. But I think we'll be successful in more than people think.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Related to that, like one of my favorite, I guess, brain theories is the entropic brain theory from Dr. Roger Carhart Harris. And the theory is that because when they were looking at even just some of the data on psychedelics and how they're overlapping with many different areas, brings up the question, even like what you were saying, Nick, you've got multiple indications and different trials for different things. I think historically, at least I was taught that this part of the brain only does this thing, or even in physiology, like your cardiac system only does this, and everything was very siloed. And what we've learned over time, if anything, there's things way communicating more than we ever thought. Brain-derived neurotrophic factors probably produced mostly by muscle, but exerts its primary effects in the brain itself. So there's a much more crossover and complementary things going on. But according to his theory, is that the different diseases you can mark them on this scale of entropy or this scale of disorder. So on one end, maybe you've got people that are bipolar. They've got way too much entropy, way too much disorder in their brain, so much so that they split off different personalities to try to deal with it as a coping mechanism. To the other end of the brain, where maybe you have like OCD, where people just don't have enough flexibility. They're very rigid. They have to follow the same patterns all the time. And their argument is that if it is a flexibility issue, maybe things like, potentially like your device, or they're looking at psychedelics can increase entropy and maybe different parts of the brain and different mechanisms, and we can push people closer to what would be more of a, air quotes, normal type function. So I would imagine with the area of the brain that you're treating, is it something that from a big theory is kind of similar. You're just trying to get that part of the brain to work a little bit better. You're trying to get it back to be more coupled and coordinated with the other parts of the brain. And then you see a lot of times these benefits across multiple different areas that on its face value would appear like they're completely different things.
Okay, that's right. That's a fascinating theory. I hadn't heard that one, so I'm gonna look that one up. But I think again, it sounds kind of like a cop out, but I think we need to be more transparent in that the reality is we still understand very little about the brain and
Yeah,
how it works. We talk about it as this holistic organ entity, whatever. But we still don't really understand even what causes headaches to a certain extent. Or, we have everyone has the same biology sort of charts of the brain, but I think that's been shocking to me. And there's this hesitation, I think, in the research and to some extent the medical field to acknowledge that that we actually don't understand. And we don't really understand how drugs work or what they impact. We understand the side effects. And I think the more transparent we are about that, the faster we can get to answers, whether that's about stimulation, psychedelics. I think there's incredible potential if we just ask the right questions.
yeah. And I think the question you're asking initially is a good one, is does this thing actually work? Right? Because I think sometimes in science we get too involved in mechanisms right away without showing that, hey, oh, this thing does move the needle, or this actually doesn't. And then once we have good ideas that, oh, this does move the needle, then you can kind of look at, well, why is this? Because, I've argued this with even clients I work with, that if I showed them 17 studies of this thing we did that don't work, but it worked for them, they don't give a rat's ass about the 17 studies, right? Not saying we shouldn't do the studies. I want to read the studies. I want to know what's going on. But at the end of the day, on an individual level, that person is hoping that this thing actually is working for them. They're less likely to know about the mechanism. I think the mechanisms and understanding that are definitely good. We should definitely spend money doing that, and that allows us to get maybe better therapies and to get other things. But I think sometimes there's a little too much mechanism madness of people using it to justify everything without having an actual trial or a study done showing that this actually did do what it was supposed to do.
And that is partly why so much of the focus for us on personalization, at least initially, is around identifying for a user whether or not stimulation and then stimulation for an indication will work for them.
Right.
Although again, like we've invested quite a bit in trials, and I probably shouldn't say this either, but I think people forget that trials are run in part to make sure that trials are successful. And so those outcomes, while important and certainly in driving literature forward and our understanding, are often not reflective of the average user who will then be faced with using that technology or that drug. So I think that's also worth remembering.
Yeah, and
previous life, I sat in, we'll say, many meetings of what should our clinical outcome and outputs for this thing be? And lost many hours of sleep and many, many hours of, okay, if we have them big enough we can drive a bus through, we'll probably get approval. But do we as individuals and humans feel that that is a safe thing that we would then release on the market? If we make them so tight that we are 99.99% that this is going to be the best thing ever and it's going to be the safest thing ever, ooh, well, we may never get approval on that either, right? The amount of time, the money, and everything else, plus you're doing the trial because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. So what is that in between point where everyone in the room feels safe? Like, yes, I would want this device in myself or one of my loved ones, but you also have to get these new things onto the market so people can actually use them. Otherwise, they're no good if they're 10 years later, they're still on the bench and never been implanted. This is an implantable device company, but the same ideas of we want things to be effective, we want them to be safe, but we're probably never going to be 100% right away. Can we kind of minimize the downside? Can we show that it is effective in different populations? And then kind of learn, as you're going and then iterate trying to make it better.
Absolutely. I hope more people get into regulation. And again, I think TBD, what AI means for society at large. Some people think it's going to end it. Some people think it's going to raise the bar. But I am hopeful that, particularly in the space of research and regulation, there is incredible potential. I hope to accelerate new technologies and new treatments into the end of users. That doesn't take decades or multiple years. It's too long.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. As we wrap up, I'm just curious about, since you're in this role, like what are things you do related for your own brain health? Like what are
Good
things that
question.
you've kind of put into practice? I'm always curious talking to people who have a lot of insider info, not expecting you to share any of that, but just what have you found as you as an individual that's most beneficial?
So I think I've gone through phases. I was very into, right when I joined, supplements and like the neurotropics. And I think my husband used to say that maybe I had the most expensive pee on the planet. I wasted a lot of money on like the mushrooms, not the fun kind, like the lion's mane. I can't say I noticed a difference from that. I would say I had actually a pretty bad case of COVID. Uh,
Oh.
and I noticed for the first time, I was like, is this aging or is this COVID? Like I felt for the first time I couldn't recall words. And again,
Mm.
over time it went away, but that's when I really started to actively stimulate. I looked into things like hyperbaric chambers, hypobaric chambers.
Yeah.
I don't do those regularly, but they are something that I have used to affect. Sauna is a big one for me, just from the whole body, and very boring. I've cut out really all alcohol. I haven't drunk in years.
Hmm.
And so it's really around healthy lifestyle. And I think for me right now, stress management is the big one. And I think that's what our clinical medical officer is big on, which is, you can do everything else right, but if you don't manage your stress and you don't manage like all of those demands, it's not going to matter. So it's really more about whole person health. I am not a regular faster. I've tried that. That just doesn't work for me. Like, your green juice, although I will say I used to do a prolonged fast about once a quarter
Hmm.
and I did have incredible mental clarity. So I do think there's something to that. And I do try and do that. That's about as close to a fast as I get. So fasting, sauna, stimulation. I do use some creatine and CoQ10, but those are basically my only supplements now. And then regular exercise. I'm trying to get out in the world and touch grass.
Awesome. I think it's this great irony that people who are busy running health companies, or I've often joked that like when I went back to do my PhD, it was probably the most unhealthy period of my entire
Oh,
life by far.
for
There's
sure.
this
Uh,
great irony of like you're trying to keep it all together to do these things that are, on the grand scale super beneficial, but making sure you keep it together on an individual level too.
no, absolutely. And, I got, there was a point where, particularly when you start to get into the space and the wellness space and the longevity space, you start to be like, should I be on stem cells? what is this methylene blue?
Yeah.
And, we're working 20-hour days and I'm not moving from a chair. And I think, our medical director, Dr. Garcha, is just like, you need to get up and take a walk. Like, you need to go do some
Yeah.
physical exercise. And I think, there is a tendency to look for quick fixes in a way. And there's a lot of stuff that we just get back out in nature. It's like, don't drink clothing dye. Okay, just take a walk. And I think sometimes simple is best. But yes, you go to some of the health conferences and you wonder, like, is this really healthcare? Because people are unhealthy visually. So
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Where can people learn all about the device? Best places to go?
yeah, you can find us at haloneuroscience.com or flowneuroscience.com. Thank you for having me. It was awesome to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would highly encourage people to check it out, and thank you for all the great science and everything else you've published in that area, because as you know, that's a rarity with devices and whatever. It feels like everyone throws whatever on the market with the zero background at all. So it's awesome to see that there's actual data behind it, which is great.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Really, really appreciate it. Huge thanks to Erin for taking her time and coming on the podcast and just giving us the rundown of everything that is going on. As of this podcast, I'm still testing the device, so I don't have any too much feedback yet, but maybe later I definitely will. And if you want more information, you can check them out in the links down below. And if you want more information from me, hop onto my newsletter, which is free. You get all the cool insider information. Probably about 90% of the content I put out goes exclusively to the newsletter, and it's free to hop on, and we'll give you a cool free gift also. So we'll put that link down below, or you can just go to MikeTNelson.com, go to the top, and go under newsletter. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We really appreciate it. If you could help us out by leaving us whatever stars you feel are appropriate, subscribing, downloading, hitting the like button, especially subscriptions on YouTube helps us a ton. Most of our podcast is audio by far. We're trying to work on growing the YouTube area a little bit more. And thank you so much again for listening. If you have someone who's interested in this, please forward it on. Appreciate it, and we'll talk to all of you again next week.
Did you see that?
Yes, the frog is certainly taking a beating on this show.
Yeah, it's hard to feel sorry for him. We take a beating every show.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.